Hey everyone, we are going to try re-recording the sermon here. What happened on Sunday was that both of our microphones had their cords break in the middle of the service, and I didn't realize it on that second one till it was too late, so let's try going again. On Sunday, everyone gathered together and watched the Super Bowl. It turned out to not be one that was very much worth watching. It was pretty bland, but like 100 million people got together and watched the Super Bowl. And the Super Bowl is the last thing left that lots of people gather together and watch. It used to happen pretty regularly that there'd be things that people would get together and watch all at the same time, but that's not really the case anymore. People are still watching lots of things, don't get me wrong, but they are more so watching things that are suit their individual interests more, that are things that interest them in particular, right? So if you like game shows, you can always watch a game show, right? If you like the news is always on. If you like, watching housewives yell at each other, there's something for that too. No matter what you want to watch, there's always something. But it used to be, of course, that there was just 3 networks, and you watched what was on those. The high watermark, actually, for network ratings was in 1986. And so I actually kind of wondered how different things are from now to 1986. How much did things change? And so back in 1986, the top-rated show got a rating of 36, which means 36 million people, on average, were watching that show every week. This year, the highest-rated show was The Big Bang Theory, at least for the last year that we have ratings numbers for, and it was at a 10 million people. So back in 1986, 3.5 times more people were getting together and watching the same show than were this year. And I kind of got curious of that number of 10 that The Big Bang got. Where would that fit in the list back in 1986? And I had to go on that list, and I found a list of all the TV shows then and how they rated it. And I kept going back and back and back until I got to the low 70s, and that's where a 10 rating would fit. And in fact, the show with the closest ratings number to what our number one would be was, I think it was like 76 or 78, something like that. And it was a show called Life with Lucy. And as you might guess from the title, it starred Lucille Ball. And don't get it confused with one of her successful shows like I Love Lucy, or The Lucy Show, or Here's Lucy, or the Lucy Desi Variety Hour, or any of the specials she had, or movies. It wasn't like any of those. It was pretty much forgettable. It aired for 7 weeks. Got that rating of 10, ranked in the bottom 5 of all shows that year, and then was gone. And it turned out that she kind of decided to stay away from the public eye after that too. But what a change, right? Back then, a show that even though it starred a living legend like Lucille Ball is almost entirely forgotten about, now that same kind of number would rank you number 1. Things change sometimes, and we don't even notice it. Today's reading kind of was one of those things where it got me thinking about how things change and you don't necessarily think about it. That's one of the reasons why sometimes it takes some effort to go through some of the Bible stories, is because some of them just assume things about the way daily life works that we don't assume anymore and isn't how daily life works anymore. And so you have to kind of look at what's going on a bit closer. In today's reading, we have the new disciples who Jesus is pulling together. They go to Simon's house, which is Peter's house, and they are going there after Jesus has done some healing and some teaching, and it turns out that Peter's mother-in-law is sick, and Jesus heals her. And that was one of those moments where I noticed that something had changed about the way society works, because Peter had a mother-in-law? It's not something I really thought about, but boy, when we talk about Peter, we see him traveling across the ancient world. We see him following Jesus for 3 years. We see him giving his life eventually on a cross. We see Peter throughout his life, and you don't really think of the fact that he's got a wife back home. Maybe he even has kids, but I guess you don't think about the fact that when he's giving things up, right, and jumping off the boat last week and joining up with Jesus, that aside from leaving behind things like parents, he's also leaving behind a family of his own household with his own wife, and like I said, probably his own kids, his own family, his own mother-in-law, who I guess lives with him. Maybe that's why he was so eager to get out of the house, who knows. But you don't think of it, right? Because that is something that would have happened more often back then, right? If you were a traveling trader, or if you were a merchant of some sort, or a fisherman who fished for things that weren't just off the coast, maybe you were in the military or someone with a political connection. These people left their homes for work all the time. And so you don't it wasn't worth noting that, oh yeah, Peter left behind this family too. But I think it's a reminder of just how serious Peter took that call, and how serious we should take our calls too, that Peter was willing to make that bold sacrifice of leaving his family behind to finish the ministry, to carry on and then finish spreading the gospel throughout his life. But to live into that call, Peter left behind so much. And, I don't think that we're called to move to Alaska and leave our families behind, right? I think that there's no shortage of God's work to do here in Lancaster, here in New York, here in our community. But I think what we are called to do is to give everything we've got, just like Peter did, right? To give without hesitation, to devote our lives to God in a way where we give everything that we are to that. Which kind of brings me back to that Life with Lucy show. I got curious as I was looking into it of why didn't this show succeed? Right, it had Lucy in it, and she was a big star and well regarded, kind of a national treasure. And so I actually called up my mom and I said, "Did you watch this show?" And she said, "Yeah, I think so, but I don't really remember it." And I said, "Why was it bad?" And she couldn't really think of it, but she did point out to me that the exact same writers that she had on I Love Lucy and even her radio show from the 40s were the writers that she hired in the 80s to be on this show. And a lot of the cast, again, was people that she had with her for decades and decades. And so as I got to looking at it, what had happened was that she made the exact same show. And that people weren't looking for a 1950s sitcom in the 1980s, right? People had different tastes at the time. They had moved on some. And so it just had a hard time finding an audience because times had changed a bit. And on top of that, she kept doing her physical comedy that she was so known for, and a 30 or 40-year-old woman doing pratfalls and doing that physical comedy was funny. A 75-year-old woman doing it just made people feel nervous. You don't want to watch 75-year-old Lucy falling around, and that's not funny. That makes me worry. That seems to be what happened. I couldn't help but think, though, that exact reason why it didn't succeed then is probably why it would succeed today. Because like I've said, people have their fractured interests and there's all kinds of niche markets out there for all the different things that people are interested in. And there certainly is no shortage of people who miss those shows from the 50s, right? And people would, I think that with how fractured things are now, that Lucy probably would have found an audience for people that missed the way TV was back in the 50s and would be happy to watch her recreate that magic again years later. But it's interesting to me that the reason she didn't succeed is because she knew so clearly who she was, what kind of show she did, and even if things had changed a bit between 1952 and 1986, she was just going to be who she was. I think that says a little bit about how it is that we can follow Peter in giving all of who we are, right? And I mean, what I mean by that is for him, it involved leaving his family behind and following Jesus, and I don't think we're called to do that, but like I said, we're called to give all of who we are. And what that means is each one of us is interesting and peculiar and particular and an individual. We each have our own gifts and talents and interests and abilities, and I think that what we are called to do and what the example of Peter can remind us is that we're supposed to give all of who we are in the ways that we can to God. Just like Lucy knew really clearly who she was when she made that show, I think that we're encouraged to figure out who we are, to figure out the gifts that we have, the ways that we want to do things, and then do that for God. Do that in a way that brings glory to God, brings people awareness of who God is, helps people understand God. We actually see that throughout the Gospels and throughout Acts of the Apostles, where as we get to know Peter and James and John and later Paul, we see that their ministry fits so much with who they were as a person. The way they did ministry was a way that only they could. And we're called to do the same. Right? That as society changes and as people change and as we move from everyone watching a few things to everyone watching a whole variety of things, that as we move from things needing to be one way to niche markets having, as all these things change, the one thing that doesn't change is the need for people to hear the gospel. And what we can do in those situations, what we can do in those ways, is be ourselves, know who we are, figure out who we are better, and use that individual that we are and that we grow into being to serve God, to serve the gospel, and to give our all. Paul left his family behind to follow Jesus, and I think that in a similar way, instead of leaving things behind, I think we're called to figure out more who we are. Serve the gospel in that way. Be God's hands and feet and arms in this world in that way. There's a way of doing ministry that only you can do. My prayer is that you figure out what that is and do it with your whole heart. Amen.